Rainier, thank you very much for joining me on this podcast, this conversation.
I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, I was saying a few moments ago just how excited I am to get to be with you, and I had enjoyed some encounters with you earlier in the year, and um, so good to finally be together again.
Mm. I was part of a group that you run called a men's group called The Rope, and at the start of each of those sessions, you would typically open with some words, whether it be a poem or some song lyrics. And I've got a poem here which I'd like to start our conversation with as a bit of a stepping stone into what we might talk about. I'm sure you're familiar with this one. It's called The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, a momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honourably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. It's The Guest House by Rumi. Wondering who's knocking on your door as a guest today.
Yeah, and as soon as I was hearing those words, I was thinking how joy is sacred, delight is sacred, but so is sorrow, so is grief. And I think that in our effort to button up the pleasurable experiences of being alive, because God, don't we all want happiness? Don't we all want delightedness? But in an effort to make that our dominant experience, we ignore these other guests so often. About a month ago, my father died. And he slipped away just a few minutes after noon, just before lunchtime. And my first impulse was to make a casserole. No joke. Uh, it's the sort of thing you kind of hear about, but don't take seriously until it happens to you. This compulsion, to scoop up some sort of cheesy surprise dish, you know, that you will enjoy alongside others who, just like you, won't know what to say between all of the tears and the dizzying recognition that someone you've known your whole life is just no longer there for you to share a meal with. He's no longer there to tell you that this is his favorite of any casserole he's ever had. And even though he's just being kind, doesn't matter because it's your dad and you know that he's really saying, I love you. So I guess today my thoughts are about grief, about the role it plays in transforming our hearts, about how it accomplishes this not measured in years or in months or even any long stretch, in the twinkling of an eye, how simply even crossing the threshold into grief is transformative if you let it. I think that's what comes up for me today.
Mm. Thank you for sharing. It's grief. You've been writing about this. I've noticed it's something that's been a part of what you share online, and a lot of people might be familiar with you, or who might have come to your work through Instagram and the posts that you write there. I know you write elsewhere, and you've published a book also, but Instagram seems to be a place where there's a lot of it's a home for a lot of your work, and it seems to be a place where you're able to really effectively communicate some quite complex experiences and human emotions, and do so in a way that is readily scrollable. You can swipe through a few tiles. Well, this is my experience anyway. Swipe through a few tiles and just pause for a minute or two and really connect with something quite quite profound. And grief is one of those things. I think you wrote a little while back that grief is another word for love, and we talk about love, we write about love, we read about love, but we don't often talk or write or read so much about grief. And you talk about it being two sides of the same coin of experience. And so, how's that experience of witnessing and grieving the passing of your father? How has that helped you to understand or expand your experience or awareness of love?
I think that there was this moment when he passed, where I became painfully aware that all of the conversations leading up to that moment were such extraordinary wastes of time. I was thinking of how the night before, just the night before he breathed his last, my siblings and my mother and I were gathered in the living room while he was still alive, still with us. And we were talking about, all of the measures we were going to take, and, who would be with him next week. And boy, didn't we get into a real squabble about this thing that was a month off. And gosh, he would like it this way. And if we only did this, and if we could just make sure that, what a tremendous, generous waste of time that was. And I think that we often are trying to stop time. We often are trying to freeze frame those moments with these conversations. If I can just arrange it just so. And that's a lot like love, isn't it? If I can just engineer it, if we can just make these rules, if we can just create these agreements, if we have it out in this way, if we just make sure, if we have this experience, if we, we're always bartering with the ending. If I arrange life in this way, I can make sure that the ending won't happen. The end comes, whether tomorrow morning or the next day or the next year. The ending comes. A lot of people don't like to hear this about love, by the way. We like our idea that love not only victimizes us, but it victimizes us forever. Love catches us off guard, it spins us up, it turns us around, it throws us into a pit, and we fall into it. We have been coerced by love. And then if the love is real good, it will extend unnaturally beyond any life cycle and will go forever and ever and ever, and we'll meet again in the next lifetime on the next planet Nibu, and there we will find one another again. And it's a really extraordinary approach. The thing that grief teaches us is that the ending, we live like every hero or heroine under the hand of doom. We cannot prevent the ending. It is how we meet it. It is how we throw ourselves at it. And I think that's why grief teaches us a lot about love. Just even by its very occurrence, the finality of things.
Why do you think it's so hard for us to, well, I think for as long as human beings have lived, there's always been a fear of death or an avoidance of it. Not in different cultures, I understand that there's a different relationship to death and cycles, and perhaps there, from my experience, there hasn't been a lot of that acceptance, discussion, and awareness of the reality of death, and therefore grief and acknowledgement of endings. And I think that in my experience has really contributed to, why it's hard to let go of people or things or experiences, or just to acknowledge endings, let alone celebrate or move through them with a sense of gratitude or appreciation for the experience. But is that something that that you notice too in the work that you've done? I know you've worked for a long time as a psychotherapist and a counselor. You're a pastor and in a previous life as well. So I imagine you've dealt with a lot of people you've worked with a lot of people dealing with endings. Is it a universal human experience from your experience that it's hard for people to let go?
Yeah, certainly in the West. My guess is it's everywhere at this point. Dominant culture is not only Western culture today; it's everywhere. There's a monoculture today, and and it's seeped into most places. Just 8,000 years ago, we could say that the whole world over, was largely immediate return hunter-gatherer tribes and band societies, whole world over. Today, that's probably less than 1% of the population. The human hive mind, city life, civilization has extended like a virus over all of us. And that human hive mind, that civilized mind, is convinced of and addicted to its own perpetuation. And when you watch the development of the human species writ large, and you kind of look at it as a global situation, maybe you were to project it onto some kind of claymation or animation, you would see the rise of the city-state in Mesopotamia. Like a single-celled organism, it kind of rises up. There's a little flare, but from there, suddenly you begin to see it fan out. It looks very viral, actually, the way that eventually it covers the globe, consuming all resources, consuming all things. And what's it dedicated to? What is this human hive mind dedicated to? Its own perpetuation. And that's true at the large level. It's also true at the individual level. And so the story of that hive mind, the story of that civilization project, is really a story about the addiction to permanence. What will we establish for ourselves? How will we make ourselves known? What kind of monuments can we build that outlive us? The first people dipping their toes into civilizations are the great monument builders. And today we're still building skyscrapers. We're still building things that will outlive us, like plastics. We're still doing these things to try and carve our face on the rock so that we can extend. There's a real addiction to that. And I read one anthropologist who said it so well, that one almost becomes convinced that since our earliest histories, we have been on a flight from a primal jungle, a murder scene where a corpse was left behind and we were guilty of bloodshed. And you do kind of get this sense of like we're fleeing something in our past. That's the story writ large. And here I am pontificating about it. But at the individual level, it's not too different. God, we tune out anything that might sound like an ending. And of course, that thing that we're tuning out mostly is our own snuffing out, is our own extinction. Very, very difficult for us to sit with. So we arrange a number of things in our life. We avoid a number of things. Anything that kind of carries the resonance of that ultimate end. So, we avoid stillness. We avoid aloneness. We can't hold these things because they suggest to us that ultimate ending. So we hoard experiences, we hoard emotions, we hoard relationships. Today, almost everything is in kind of this deep search for the extension, the unnatural extension of this experience. But what would happen if we gave ourselves to the reality that this ends? This ends. This life ends. Relationship ends. Experience, this emotion, that there is nothing permanent, that this too shall pass. What would change if we knew the impermanence of our state? Well, I think a lot of people will say, I'd fall into madness. God, we can't live under that kind of existential dread. Well, it's no longer dread, is it? I'm not dreading it at all. I'm not living under that dread. How do we do that? Well, for one thing, I think we become acclimated to it early. I'm thinking of a moment in which my children were very, very little. I have 4 kids, now feel very, very grown. They're not, but they're in their later teenage years. And when they were little, we were gifted this beautiful 6-year-old dog, beautiful golden lab, and so wonderful, so nice, so kind. But it grew up a country dog, and we lived in the city. And she had kind of these country sensibilities. She didn't quite understand traffic. She'd get real skittish. She'd spook quite easily. Well, about a month in, one of my kids accidentally came in the house, leaves the door open. She runs out. I hear a screech, hear a thud. Beautiful dog laying there in the middle of the road. I think she was instantly killed. The car's speeding off. I run out, I pick up into my arms this 80-pound dog who is still warm, and I carry her back, this dog that our kids had fallen in love with in an instant, a month earlier, carry it back, and I lay her under the apple tree in our front yard. And our children poured out. We didn't shield them from it. And they lay their hands on her, and the life is passing from her. The breath is already gone, but now the heat going. For an hour, their beautiful little hands are rubbing her belly, scratching her, and running their fingers through her hair. That's how we taught them about death. My parents came over. My father was a Christian minister and a televangelist. He performed a funeral for us. We buried her under the apple tree. My mother said a few poignant things, quoted a scripture. She said, and it's like it says in scripture, all dogs go to heaven. And my daughter, who was 4 years old at the time, leans over to me and said, Dad, I don't think the Bible says that, does it? And I laughed and I said, no, it does not. But they didn't need heaven. They didn't need the thought of heaven, those kids. They had seen the fullness. They experienced the life cycle right there. They didn't need this idea of someday, one day, of perpetuation. They were okay with an end. And so I tell you, they were in the room. My kids were in the room when my father passed. My teenage children, they were laying their hands on him. Their cousins weren't there. Their cousins couldn't be there. Too confronting. And my sibling came to me and said, God, I'm realizing that if I could go backwards, I would have acclimated them to the reality of life and death a lot earlier. But I think we're missing a piece educationally. Like we avoid those things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a difficult experience to come to terms with is death, and there's no way to prepare for it other than to acknowledge that it's inevitable and to be exposed to that in that way. I think pets for a lot of families and a lot of kids growing up is their first experience, first exposure to death. I'd like to stay on this topic of your father. I'm just really fascinated about your upbringing. You talked about your children, some of the experiences that they're having, and I'm sure you're witnessing some of your own experience reflected through theirs, and reflecting on your childhood growing up, with the recent time you've spent with your father and his passing. I'm just really fascinated about him being a televangelist and you growing up. I can only imagine the kind of lifestyle that you had, and then how you came to be doing the kind of work you're doing now, which doesn't sound it's not particularly puritanical. A lot of what I love about you and your work is that you embrace and celebrate the entire spectrum of the human experience, and that really does embrace the failures and the mistakes and the grief and the shame and the guilt and all of it. It doesn't. The work you do, I think, provides a lot of permission for people to just be fully expressed in all of their humanity in a way that I imagine perhaps wasn't afforded to you growing up with a father who was an evangelical priest or pastor. So yeah, I'd love to hear how that evolution was like for you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what people know about these particular strands of very large religion, Christianity, but I grew up in a sect called evangelicalism, which I think, largely today is parodied and lampooned, and I think a lot of it rightly so, and quite frankly has done a lot of damage in many, many ways. But there were some core things historically that it stood for that seeped through early on in my upbringing. One of the things that evangelicalism, tracing its history in Christianity back into the 1800s in the Western settling of the United States, was this idea of the immediate forgiveness of wrongdoing. And I think that is such an important ideal. Sometimes I even think historically about different world religions. I think, why did an idea catch on? Why did a meme catch on? And I actually take that thought even back further. I take it back to northern Germany. Why did paganism dissipate and Christianity come in so successfully? And I think we could say, well, God, they executed anyone who said no. Certainly that was there. But people also fervently bought into it. Why? Well, one of the reasons, as far as I can see, both the middle of the 1800s as well as this further back time I'm pointing to 1,000 years earlier, is because of this idea of grace, this concept of grace. And what I mean by grace is this undeserved gift, the idea of forgiveness or absolution, this idea of the setting of things right. And I think so much of the world has been, for thousands and thousands of years, built on a very different concept, a very evolutionary concept, a concept that might makes right, a concept that what you get is what you deserve. And I think it's an extraordinary idea that I would look at someone who deserves, perhaps rightly so, to get kicked, get pushed away, to become a pariah from society, and instead to include them in embrace. What an extraordinary idea. And one that I find, no matter who you are, no matter if you're a Green Beret or a card-carrying member of the most liberal and progressive ideology, or, a dyed-in-the-wool evangelical Republican in the United States, no matter who you are, we all find ourselves at times in need of a second, third, or fourth chance. We all find ourselves in need, desperately hungry of someone looking at us and saying, I see something more than your resume. Kid, I'm willing to give you another shot. And I think that one of the reasons why this meme of Christianity caught on is this idea of grace. And certainly evangelical Christianity at its root is this idea of this extraordinary gift that we don't deserve. And I think as a kid, that was very compelling for me to hear. The other thing I heard from my father's pulpit was the resolute urgency of now, that it's not for tomorrow, that God's kingdom is not one day or someday. It is today. Choose it. Choose it daily. Choose it in your action. And I think how so much of my own, the things I talk about consistently can be wrapped up in those two ideas right there. The grace. And you said, how I talk about the whole of experience and kind of give permission for humans to have the totality of the experience. Well, what am I talking about here? Grace. I'm really talking about this idea of the compassion of being alive. Tremendous compassionate view of our fellow human beings. I'm talking about grace. Talking about looking at people and saying, actually, I think there's more going on than meets the eye. I think the thing I'm often trying to talk about is this idea of this moment. This moment is what counts. Make your whole life count. Choose. Become what you do. Right? And so these concepts truly, I think, were embedded in me as a child. Now, there was a lot of other things that were too, and I think that's really what you're talking about here. But I think I had to preamble that. Also wrapped up in that idea of making choices daily. There is a very puritanical approach. Make the right choices, damn it. And so there's a high degree of intolerance. And certainly the spheres that I grew up in were probably even more intolerant than most others. I grew up in a very, very conservative sect of this branch of Christianity. And a lot of that fell on women, actually. Women couldn't wear like pants because those were men's clothing, and we didn't want any gender bending, which today is kind of humorous almost to look at that. Televisions weren't allowed. The internet, after it was incepted, was also a horrible thing. And I got to be honest, I was someone from very early on who had a hard time following the rules. But I think I grew up in a family that also had that. My father, for as much as he was in that system and institution, I think he bucked a lot of those trends too. When I was 6 years old, he actually left that highly conservative denomination and fanned out and kind of started his own movement. But I remember a story that is told often of me when I was little. You'd find loopholes. So you couldn't have a television, but you could have a computer monitor. You couldn't have a television, but you could have a computer monitor, and you could wire cable news in there, or you could watch on a VCR. So it was the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law you're going after right there. But, a very important person in that denomination came and visited, and I promptly took them to the closet and showed them the computer monitor that had been put away for their visit. But I promptly went and I showed it to them. I wanted them to see just how rebellious they were. And so I think I was always finding ways, to kind of flagrantly show that, I or whoever I was connected to, were going to buck the trend. At 16 years old, I remember my father stepping into this huge mega church system where he was a pastor of, and I wore a beer T-shirt and jeans that were torn. And I love that my dad didn't actually chastise me for it. But I tell you, I got up there and my brother chastised me later, and he said, "Man, you really embarrassed us up there." And I chuckled and I said, "Well, if they can love me in spite of how I look, then they must really love me." And I said that at 16, and I think that to some extent I still kind of hold that thought. I want to make the cost of entry expensive enough to where I know that you really want what you're getting.
I wonder, this concept of grace and forgiveness and acceptance, it seems like culturally, in popular culture, at least in social media, we're finding it very hard to practice that, and noticing that there's an increasing divide and polarity amongst people who are really scrambling for something to believe in and something to make sense of what is quite uncertain times. And so over the years, there's been times where you have been where you've dealt with being isolated, perhaps even sort of exiled from communities and friendship groups and so on, cancelled for want of a better word. But it seems it's an increasingly common experience that people who have done something that is counter to the expectations of others are very quickly shamed and exiled and cancelled, as opposed to being invited to sort of share what their motivation was, perhaps their intention. And I'm just noticing it's really hard for people to accept some of the things that might be a little hard for others to accept. And these shadows are kind of increasing, and they're growing, and they're overtaking a lot of the experience that we're having. So this shame and guilt as a consequence of a lack of grace and forgiveness playing out on a very 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 kind of social context right now online. I'm wondering what your experience of that is, and the reason I asked that of you, because you've been quite open about sharing some of this, and particularly with your podcast, that it's such a wonderful perspective. Love Like Hell, I believe it's called, which I want to talk about the name as well. But in that podcast, you share experiences from two different perspectives, yours and your wife's, Christy's. You both talk about the same experiences that you're having in relationship or have had in relationship, and then you'll each share your perspective and then come together and discuss. It's beautifully produced. It's such a wonderful podcast to listen to. But what I loved about that was your willingness to talk, not only talk about, but to acknowledge some of the things that a lot of people really struggle with. So in a context such as social media or podcast or public sphere, to be able to do that, I think is really important, and it doesn't happen often enough. And so I'm wondering whether you feel like that's something that's important to share, and whether that's and what's been your experience of sharing some of your indiscretions publicly.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it doesn't ever feel good to be the guy who was unfaithful. I was saying that to my partner Christy the other day. It's like, oh, it never feels good to, that's your brand. She laughed and she said, yeah, it doesn't also ever feel very good to be the person who, just took you back. It's so easy to get pigeonholed in these categories. Listen, someone once asked me a very similar question, said, God, what's it like? Share this story. And I said, what else am I going to do? It's actually my story. I don't have another story. It's not like I have a better story I could share here. This is just a part of the fabric of my life. It's one part. But it is a part of it. So, if I'm going to share a story, then I'm going to share the story I know. And, when I think of how infidelity touches so many people's lives, and, statistically, some of the most current statistics that we have on the topic show that somewhere around, 60% of males say that they've cheated on a partner. A dramatically smaller number of females have said that they do, although Researchers believe that it's actually far closer, upwards of 50 to 55% of females have. So, in other words, we're dealing with a culture that is tremendously active sexually, that doesn't actually know how to deal with the problems that they're sitting with in relationship. We don't know how. We're also a culture that practices serial monogamy, as opposed to, say, 75 years ago, in which if you were in a relationship, it was your first relationship and it was the relationship that would extend for life. And if it ended, you probably at least were thinking twice before starting a new relationship. And there would certainly be a duration where you wouldn't. Today, you get out of one relationship and the ubiquitous sign of healing is, well, now I'm ready for a new one. So if I'm healed, well, the next day I'm in one, and chances are I started it 3 weeks ago already. So that is quite simply the fabric of our world. And my life was reflective of the exact same principles. Now, I had the graduate degree, I had the profession. Listen, I've stood in the boardrooms, I've stood in the back rooms, I've stood in the coffee rooms of the halls of counseling and psychotherapy. It's not like these people are the people who are getting their lives right. They're just the people who are sitting with you while your life is hell, and they're scratching their head and thinking, God, lucky I didn't get caught. Right? That is what is happening. Nobody has it together here. I mean, that's the really humorous thing. And if we're very honest, a lot of the people who become our healers and helpers actually became that because it was easier to pay for a graduate degree to become a healer or helper than it was to actually do the hard work of transformation. So I found myself in those shoes. I had been unfaithful to every partner I had ever had. I hadn't made agreements I could keep, and I certainly was not keeping the agreements I had made. The truth was, I had a problem. My problem was keeping agreements, first with myself, then with everyone else around me. That was the unshakable truth of my life. I was a flickering flame. I was a wavering candle. And I think that continued in all these different domains until the pain point got high enough. And that really is how transformation works. We're remarkably comfort-seeking as creatures. We will stay with the familiar, even though it's painful, because it's quite simply more comfortable than to choose something else. I'll hang with the pain because it's familiar. I know the pain. That thing over there sounds like it would be less pain, but God, I don't know. So I'll go with my certainty every time. We like that permanence thing we were talking about earlier. And, that was the wager I was making in life. It became unmistakably clear to me that I could not maintain that. And as you pointed to, my own relationships had involved a network of who I was. At that point in time, you've kind of achieved a bit of an ego mass here. You've become a person who people go, oh, wow, they would never do that. And then you're the person who did that, right? You're the person who lied. You're the person who was unfaithful. And suddenly everyone is now saying, oh, dear God, well, he doesn't have it together after all. Oh, wow, he's not who we thought. He's not a very good guy. And that was exactly what it was. Listen, anytime we're surprised about someone else's behavior, we've gone asleep. we're asleep when we're surprised by people's bad behavior. We shouldn't be surprised. But, I chose in that moment in time to say this, that if the plates were falling down around me, and they were, all the plates I had kept juggling in the air, my relationships, my friendships, my career at that point, my social circles, it felt like they were all falling to the ground. And I made a very important decision in that moment. I decided that I could watch them all crash. I could be fine with that if I could simply regain, or gain for the first time, integrity. And that became my single-minded pursuit: truth, authenticity, bringing my whole self into the room. And those were the lessons that I committed myself to. There were some injustices in those moments. I really felt like I felt like society in that moment was hardwired against graceful landings. Nobody wanted to give anybody a second chance unless it was you, and then you desperately wanted a second chance. And I at times felt that pang of injustice. And I had a mentor wisely say to me during that time, hey, don't get stuck there. This is an opportunity for your transformation. And so that's exactly what I did. I buckled down, and I did not care a hoot about what was happening beyond the walls of the room I was finding myself in, which was largely learning how to deal with my own self, the shadows that I had been casting, the parts of myself that had gone long undeveloped. It was the opportunity I had to commit myself to the work of becoming an individuated soul. And I knew it. And so, I climbed down, toppled down, whatever you might say, from the pulpits and the places I was in, and slunk into a blue collar job for about a year and a half, where I laid floors and I delivered materials out of a package car during that time. I barely made ends meet, scratched it together on savings, and felt pretty lucky that I had any kind of ability to have friends or anything like that. And what I found was something tougher than granite internally, something like integrity, something like a commitment to bringing who I was into the room. And that was a deep gift during that time. And it occurred to me in that whole process how rare that is. God, it's so rare. Most of us go through life just lying. And by that, I mean not showing who we are, not saying who we are, avoiding, minimizing, dodging at every turn anything that will take us out of a sense of being rejected. And we call that living a life. I was committed to no longer doing that. I like your question that you kind of began with there about the commentary on culture at large, the role of grace. I do have this concern, less for the places that I inhabited, but actually just for culture at large. I think one thing our population renders it possible, at 7 point some billion people in the world, everybody has their double. And it's quite simply more convenient to go with the guy who has less mistakes. Right? Like, I'm not going to hire you if I've got a guy with the exact same skill set who doesn't have 2 strikes. It's an effectiveness issue. I get that. I think, unfortunately, it has contributed to a kind of disposability. We don't want you. We don't want your baggage. And that's an HR move. And I find it despicable in general. It's very dehumanizing. I think instead, when we sit with people, real people, and we hear their real stories, and I've heard some tremendous, tragic stories of people who have done some real bad things that people would consider heinous. And I've been able to sit with them and hear them and have a great deal of compassion on their lived experience, because they're just another human. Life is too short. Life is too short not to have compassion for the person sitting across from you. And so I find that this kind of pandemic we're in of gracelessness to be troubling. And probably the greatest reason is because we all want grace. We really do. Like, we're great with, not giving people a second chance. Yeah, we're great with it. We're great with minimizing people's experience. We're great with it until it comes to us. And then we go, oh God, please, somebody listen to me. I've got a story.
Is it that we don't know how to, we don't have examples, role models? It feels like culturally we're sort of devoid of, or starving for examples of grace and forgiveness, and a way to sort of work through some of those really difficult times when you're faced with that, um, with that for yourself. You talked about, your lack of, keeping agreements, and lack of integrity. I'm curious. I'm sure you had some tools and resources available to you through what it is that through the work that you've done and your education as a psychotherapist and counselor and pastor. But I wonder whether it's, a lot of people sort of come to that point where they're like, I really need to acknowledge what's not working here, and deal with the pain and the suffering that it's causing me and others, but I don't know how to, and I don't know where to go. And I wonder if you notice because you work with men and women and couples and individuals. I'm curious specifically about the experience that men have, from your observation about how to do this, where to start, and whether that lack of, culturally, that lack of, sort of support, and availability of support is something that is what stops people and men doing that work.
Yeah. Well, one thing I am actually greatly encouraged by is that today I think there are a good many more resources than there ever have been. Especially, I think, for a growing population of men who are trying to regain their own sense of soul. Culturally, I think men are in an interesting bind, right? For one thing, we're told to be sensitive, and we are told to be sensitive, and we are taught to tap into emotions that, for probably thousands of years, we were told our role necessitated bypassing those very emotions. So we're having to learn very fast, actually, how to serve a different function in the tribe, while at the same time getting the message that we don't want you to be too sensitive. We actually want you to hold our emotions for us. We'd like you to, what was that Jewel song? You'll be fashionably sensitive, but too cool to care.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we are kind of given that mixed message, right? Oh, we want you to be our rock. We want you to be the shoulder we can cry on. We want you to be our protector, our provider. I mean, that is actually a message men still get quite a bit. But please share your emotion. Not that emotion. Please don't. That's too big. Not that emotion. That's too scary. That shuts me down. I think on and on. We get such mixed messages. Probably everyone does. But I do think men are at an interesting place from an anthropological analysis that we've just not been in before. We're going to get it wrong. I think that, we're fumbling our way around in this one. But I am encouraged because I see groups that exist for men and men's work of coming out, a second kind of wave of the expressive men's movement that was begun in the early 1990s. I think back, my father took me to some of those early men's gatherings in the mid-90s. I was just a teenager, but he took me to some of those times. And I remember standing in a room filled with men who were each confessing infidelity or racism or a lack of keeping their own agreement. I remember those movements in the mid-90s, and they were very, very powerful. They kind of dissipated towards the end of that decade. But I think that there has been a recovery of that, and it's smarter too. I don't think it's quite as reactive. I like how David Dada put it, beyond the macho jerk and the new age wimp. And I think that we're dealing, in those terminologies, these polarities. And I think we've moved beyond it. I think a lot of the men I talk to are warrior poets. Right? They're men who are embodying, toughness and tenderness at the same time. I think you want to have a hand in both pockets. I think that's that dialectic, right? And I think that really is coming forward today. As far as what resources exist, I mean, here's the thing. You said that maybe because I had this background, I had some resources. I had nothing. Boy, I didn't. I tell you, when something happens to you that knocks you off your apple cart, the the thing that you're struck with is you've got nothing. You've got no one. And the first step is the same for everyone. It's to say, holy shit, I've got a problem. This is a real problem. And I think that the thing that you can always guarantee is that you'll be afforded the opportunity to minimize that problem, to deny that problem, to lie about that problem, to hide it, to avoid it, or to be honest. I went to a gentleman. This was shortly after my own fall from grace. I love the drama of that. But I remember going to a gentleman who was quite well known for what he did, and I had heard his name in certain circles. And he invited me to one of his groups, and it was largely white collar men, but there were all kinds of men there, and it was pretty much aimed at people who identified with sexual addiction. That was really the focus. And I was pretty desperate. I was willing to try on almost any diagnosis at the time to accept responsibility and understand, or at least I thought I was, and so it's Saturday morning at 6 a.m. and you're getting up pretty damn early to go be a part of a room full of guys, and they're all going around the room saying, "Hey, my name is Bob, and I've cheated 17 times on my wife. And hey, my name is Frank, and I like having sex with animals. And hey, my name is," I mean, you hear all kinds of things, right? And they're all being so authentic. I mean, my God, they are really laying it on the line. They get to me, and I like, "Hi, my name is Rainier, and I'm actually just a journalist here to do a journalism project, a piece on this." Everybody laughed and waited the obligatory 7 seconds of silence. And somebody said, "Why are you really here?" "Well, I was caught." But I think that you get honest. That really is the first step for anyone, no matter what your situation is. First step is to actually look at it with a degree of authenticity, with a degree of honesty, and to say, here's exactly where I am. Now, what's so crazy is that first step is also the final step. You become a person of integrity. So that first step of honesty is the same as the final step of integrity. You keep on being honest. You keep on showing up as you are. You keep on boldly taking the steps to say, this is who I am. This is all of who I am. This is what I've done. This is what I've said. This is what I'm doing. This is what I'm saying. This is who I am. And that's why the first step is just as hard as the final one, because it's the same one.
Yeah, that's such a simple way of expressing it, but it feels very true. And I'm curious about your just some. I mean, so much of everything you share is very just a really, you've got a beautiful way of expressing and a very poetic way. And you're a great storyteller, and I think so much of what people resonate with in your writing and in your interviews, when you speak in your podcast, is there's really universal themes that are shared, and I think a lot of people can resonate with that in their own way. And although people's experience might not be specifically related to yours, there's a lot of kind of shared universal themes and experiences that come from that. I'm curious about your process now. Your when it comes to your work, do you have a ritual or routine for creating Do you, do you set intentions? Are you particularly disciplined when it comes to work, or do you allow and afford yourself the freedom to just be inspired and create when you feel like it? Because I I assume that you just don't sort of sit down and create something really profound just because you've scheduled it in the diary for the day. I know you've traveled and you spent a bit of time sort of focusing on your creative process, and yeah, I'm wondering whether that's how you do it. You sort of set aside some time, or there's moments during the day where you're just struck by something that's thinks worthy of capturing. Yeah, I'd love to hear about that, what that experience is like for you, and whether you wrestle with that, because it seems quite effortless, and I know it's not. Well, I'm assuming it's not. I haven't met too many, great writers or creators who do find it easy, although it might appear that way. So, yeah, I'd love to hear what your experience is like.
Yeah, I think here's what I'm trying to say in everything, that this world, this scarred over, beaten down, bare knuckled, blurry eyed world will steal your breath away. The other day, I had a rice cooker go kaput on me. And it was like right in the middle of cooking the rice, and it just died. And I'm standing there, and I'm going to read to you what happened as I was standing there. Here's literally what happened. The rice cooker dies. I look at it. I pull out my modern typewriter, which is my iPhone, and I hammer this out in the span of about a solid minute from the rice cooker dying. So I'll read it to you. Suddenly, and without any warning whatsoever, after 11 years of dedicated service, the rice cooker gave out. I wish I could say it was a glorious finale to an otherwise illustrious career. Truth is, there weren't any fireworks, or last words, or grand gestures. No frothing at the mouth or sputtering up chunky pillows of glutinous mulch. Not even a rattle or a wheeze. It just died. Which is strange, isn't it? That something so useful can give up the ghost on a dime without even having the decency to give a 2-week written notice. I wonder if everything has some sort of spark inside, flickering, hanging on till its fingers are blue and frozen at the joints. And each day, something truly extraordinary, beautiful, and practical, and good just goes away, just like that, gone. Everyone with a countdown clock ticking away the minutes until without a whisper they pass on. I don't think any less of the rice cooker. It only did what was natural. Frankly, I'm just thankful for all the times I enjoyed the fluffiest goddamn white rice you've ever seen. That tumbled out of me.
There's so much beauty and poetry and lessons and stories in everything, including something so simple and banal and mundane as a rice cooker giving up the ghost.
Well, that's just it. And so if you're paying attention to life, you're never shy of content. So I'll be really honest with you, and this is going to piss off a lot of creators. I don't work for it. Or maybe another way of saying it is I do work for it. Actually, exactly as you described, I sit down. I sit down wherever I'm at. If I'm out, if I'm in Crete, I sit down over my cappuccino. Or if I'm in the cold of the Pacific Northwest, I sit down at my corner chair facing out the window. I pull open that modern typewriter and I begin. And whatever comes out of me is exactly what I have. I don't do too many drafts. I don't do too many edits. Those are the thoughts that came out of me. They usually are about 2,200 in characters. I have a friend who is a phenomenal writer, a very gifted writer, and she laughed. She said, "You're a 2,200 character writer." Which goes along with something. I was in Mexico a while back, and a bartender said, "What is it you do?" And I said, "I'm a short essayist." And he looked at me and said, "You don't look so short."
Classic.
But I think, I'm always trying to, with an economy of words, to lure you into the human experience and to drop the floor out from under you so that you find yourself there in the basement with all of us surrounded by the emotions that we're most terrified of encountering. Now you have to confront, deal within yourself. And I think the most important thing for any creator is to create. The most important thing for a writer is to write. The most important thing for a dancer is to dance, or a singer is to sing, right? You don't actually have to plot it out. Just start. Just start. I've inevitably found that the starting of it, listen, this is the most strange thing. I can honest to God tell you, I'll pull out my pen on some days when I have a pen and I have paper and I have no thought in my head. And as soon as that pen touches down on that paper, words are there that were not there before in my mind. They simply are now there on the paper. And I have to say to myself, there's something very mystical that happens. It's like a portal opens to a fully formed world, and I'm just a conduit. I'm just a channel of something and I don't think I'm that unique. I think that I just surrender to it. Now, there's some days I don't feel like it, and this is where the same thing occurs. I say, no, I have to begin. I have to do this. And I allow myself the joy of the strict joy of stepping into those places. And what I find inevitably is the more you do it, the easier it is. I also find that the less you do it, the harder it is. So you do it. And that really is the thing, I think, for almost any creators. Gosh, you would not believe how many times someone says to me, "Oh man, I have a book in me. I've got to, everybody tells me I got to write a book." And I say, "Well, why don't you?" "Well, I just don't know what to write about." Like, just start. Just write. See what comes. We get terribly in our mind about things. Begin. That really is my process. That really is it. And so, I am not one of those content creators that sits down and says, what are we going to talk about this month? I have an assistant who helps my scheduling and sends out emails and does these kind of things. And she's always telling me I've got to be better at it. She's always saying, well, this is February. It's the month of love. So you've got to be focused on love. And God, I happen to be focused on that anyway, just because I'm thinking a lot about it for various other reasons. But I'm honest. I'm not thinking about it because it's supposed to be important. It just is where it's landing for me. I go with wherever it's landing.
I'm curious how important what role a good Negroni plays in your creative process.
Oh, this is a dangerous question. First of all, I love the Negroni, and I love the Negroni because it is like life. A Negroni is very, very simple. It is 3 simple parts, right? And vermouth, Campari, and gin. Have a twist of orange. Sometimes you have a cherry. You have a block of ice, preferably. Some people fill it with ice. I don't prefer that. It's very hard to mess up a Negroni, but you would not believe how many times I've had a Negroni that's actually been messed up. And it's usually when people get very creative with it that it really goes wrong. At its simplest, it's best. And what's good about it? Well, for one thing, it's bitter. Mm-hmm. Anyone who's ever had a Negroni will tell you that the first thing that strikes them is its bitterness. But it's also sweet. And the third thing about it is it's overwhelmingly boozy. You'll get trashed off of 3 of them pretty quickly. Now, what's the role of a Negroni in the creative process? Well, set aside Negronis and just talk about alcohol. I think one of the dangerous things that most writers I've known who were long-term writers will admit is that alcohol itself becomes an intoxicating, or rather alluring, companion for writing. And I'm going to be totally honest. boy, that's true. I get why Hemingway felt like he did his best work when he was drunk, because there's moments when, you're 2 drinks in and suddenly the stream of words that flows out into your mind, it is like the interior castles of creativity have been opened to you. And suddenly you can see things you didn't. And it's not true of other substances, but particularly alcohol tends to ignite a stream of creativity. And I think you have to be, as a writer, if I'm really candid, you have to be very cautious with it because it is seductive. So I like a good Negroni, but I tell you, I'm wary of that medicine. Every medicine has its great healing qualities, but you also have to worry about the aftermath of it. And that is one that I particularly, I go, okay, get drunk on life, but also know when to be sober too.
Wise words indeed. And I can certainly relate to just that analogy of the 3 components and parts of Negroni relating to life: the bitter, the boozy, and the sweet as well. It's a great way to express that. Something else that I think that is interesting for me to learn about your creative process is just music, the role music plays. I believe you play music, and I'm just wondering if there was like right now at this time in your life, if there was a song or an artist or an album that's a soundtrack to your life right now, what would that be?
Well, I'm going to confess that I sit down and there's a few there are a few artists who I put on to swing me into that place, that very tender place. Max Richter, who is a modern composer, often composes quite a few of whether television shows or movies, particularly around violins or stringed instruments, really stirs my soul. There's a particular song called "The Departure" from the TV show Leftovers, The Leftovers, that I have a record player and with a surround sound, and I'll put that album on, I'll put that song on, and it's only about 1minute and 20 seconds. And I'll repeat that song over and over, and the melody of it is like eternity. I think it's the closest thing I know. That probably is it. I love music that makes me feel. Quite frankly, that's what I'm trying to do with my words anyway. I'm trying to make people feel something they didn't entirely consent to feeling when they logged on to Instagram, but now there they are. And so I want music that makes me feel that way. Lana Del Rey, I think, sometimes has this wonderful cinematic quality. And my son, who's 17 years old and terribly observant, says, Dad, you and Lana Del Rey are really 2 peas in a pod. And I said, why is that? He says, well, you both have kind of this glossy way of looking at the world. Like the world is some kind of shimmering thing to both of you. I like that. I resonate with that. But Max Richter, Lana Del Rey, also I think, again, kind of that cinematic quality, but differently, is the French group M83. I've listened to a lot. I think almost anything that's sound, that's just like that shimmering wall of sound sometimes, really unleashes. Gosh, I don't know if I believe in an afterlife, and quite frankly, I don't know what's after this life. I'm not sure anybody does. If they do, they haven't told us. But I think that when I think of an afterlife, closest thing I can think of is just a wall of sound and becoming one with that great orchestral symphony. That's really what I think of.
Beautiful. What are you looking forward to at the moment?
I'm working on a book right now with my wife based on the podcast Love Like Hell. Really excited about that. It's a ways off, and getting onto the shelves, but that's something that I'm going to be giving a lot of attention to. I just finished my own second book, which I'll probably self-publish that one, although I'm not sure. And that is a collection of short narratives in first person, third person, uh, dealing with the seasons of love. And like so much of my other work, the goal of those narratives is not really to get you to understand life, it's to get you to feel life. And so I'm really excited about that. That's going to be a really great one. I hope to have that later this fall. I tell you, Michael, the thing that I'm probably most mindful of, and by the time I'm sure this podcast episode airs, it will already have gone, but my father's funeral and internment of his ashes is this upcoming weekend in our little ancestral home in East Texas, where none of my family has lived for 3 generations, and yet we all consider home. And so we'll go to this very small town of less than 1,000 people, and we'll gather around this 200-year-old cemetery, and we will sing songs that none of us sing in ordinary life, and we will hold hands. And later we'll go out to catfish and hush puppies, and then we'll fly home. And I'm pretty excited about that. Excited's probably the wrong word, but I'm looking forward to it.
And I have one last question. I'm just conscious of the time. I've got a lot of questions. Love to keep chatting. It feels like really nice just to be able to just kind of riff and talk about life, without it being too prescriptive. I said at the start of this conversation, I have a few things I want to talk about: life, death, love, just the basics. But without too much of a script, it's really nice just to talk to another man about this stuff, and to do so in a way that's very accepting and all encompassing of the entire experience of it all, and I think that, again, I come back to it, this permission. I think that you enable people with, indirectly, and people will make, meaning of whatever it is you write for themselves. But yeah, I just want to acknowledge that, and thank you for your willingness to share it all, and to do so graciously, and with your very, very unique poetic signature as well. It's always lovely to hear what you, not only what you have to say, but how you say it. It's really lovely to hear and to share this conversation with you. And for anybody who wants to hear more, I can't recommend your podcast highly enough. Love Like Hell. It's just such a wonderful. It's like being a fly on the wall to the inside of both you and your partner's heads and hearts as you navigate really, really complex issues in relationship, which I think so many people can relate to. And I think that's the other thing about your work, is the relatability of it. So yeah, listen to that podcast, and I'm sure the book will be, a wonderful extrapolation of a lot of what it is that you talk about in that podcast. Is there anything that is on your heart or mind that we haven't spoken about, or that's come up since we've been speaking, that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think that it occurs to me really to say something about hope and how dark the world can get. I was on TikTok the other day and just mindlessly scrolling as one does. I got in this weird rabbit hole, like, what do they call it? Doom scrolling.
Mm-hmm.
It was like the world was going into this vortex of darker and darker things. And I actually don't think that's just TikTok doom scrolling. I actually just think that's the noisy chatter of the world today. dark. It gets dark. It gets dark for me sometimes. I think the shadows grow long. And yet I think that's also the symmetry of a smile is defined by the shadows also. Kindness in the middle of grief. I shared a story um, on I have I guess it's a blog. I don't know what you call it these days, but a Substack called Into the Wylde that I keep, and I get to share writings that are a little bit longer than the 2,200 characters that Instagram fits. And I shared a story about a good friend of mine, and he and I both lost our fathers recently, actually 1 year exactly apart to the day. His last year, just this. And we were at a bar and we were drinking. He was having old fashions and I was having Negronis. And he worked up his courage to ask the waitress if he would have a drink after. And he politely turned him down. He was sad about it, but it wasn't the end of the world. He had just gone through a divorce. And I think he probably would have liked to have had the drink. She said something I thought quite clever at the time. She said, "You should have asked earlier." And I thought that was a lot like life, right? Like how often we let the minute pass us by, waiting for something. And as we walked home, I think just the weight of it all began to hit him, bury him deeper and deeper. It was very late at night, early in the morning, and a very busy street during the day. But that night there was no traffic, and we're crossing the street. He suddenly collapses. His knees buckle. He collapses. He falls there on the street, and he's sobbing, great heaving sobs. And I lean down. I put my arm around him. He continues sobbing very loudly. Whenever you're ushered into the presence of someone who's having one of those breaks, one of those moments where the ordinary rules of reality no longer apply, they're either very rage filled or profuse, or in this case, overwhelmingly sorrowful, covered in grief. You don't exactly know what to do. Someone has now just defied the rules of ordinary engagement. And so I leaned down, I held him there. And then off in the distance, I heard a voice. And the voice kind of called out, "Hey, hey, it's going to be okay." And I think that, I hear a lot of talk sometimes about how that can be really invalidating to be told that it's going to be okay. Don't rob me of my sorrow. Don't rob me of my pain. Boy, the voice got louder. Gonna be okay. There's a complete stranger walking down the street. Gets closer and closer. What I didn't say in the essay that I posted was, first thing he said was, "Do you smoke? Do you do you do you smoke marijuana? Because I got a joint here." And my kind of giggled in the middle of his tears and said, "No, I'm fine." And he said, "Okay, well, I'll gladly share with you what I got." And then he said, "It does get better. My wife left me for another woman over Christmas, and it was about the saddest thing that I ever thought I would have happen. I didn't even think I was going to live, but I did live, and I can tell you that even a few weeks out, it's still sad, but I'm getting through it. And I think you're going to get through it, whatever it is, too. And can I just give you a hug?" And this great bumbling stranger gives a hug, which is just about the most fragile gift in the world. It's almost meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. But I actually think it means everything. I think that humans as a species, we long for touch. Of course, it creates chemicals right? It's a chemical response as soon as we feel that familiar touch of someone else. He just held my friend there, just held him. And a few seconds went by, let go. He wandered off into the night. And I think sometimes when I get very uh, hopeless about the world, I think about how kindness can break in the middle of grief, and the kindness is heavier than the grief is. Or maybe another way of saying it is the kindness is lighter than the grief is heavy.
Mm.
Yeah. And there's a goodness to it all. And I think that really becomes the question. Can I look at the world as it is? Can I fall in love with it? Can I have the courage to let joy find me in the middle of the street of my sorrows? Can I allow the delightedness of life to waltz me even while I'm still sad, even while I'm still lonely? And I think it will if we consent to it. I think things like love, things like joy, things like transformation, they're gentlemen. They need our consent. And so we have to permit it. We have to say yes. It won't actually victimize us. But I think if we do consent to it, there's such a beauty to those moments, and it is a miracle. All of it is a miracle. And I think that's what I want to say. That in this place that I even find myself in is discovering the great miracle of life, even in endings.
Mm. Yeah, well, I am so grateful for you sharing all of what you have in this relatively brief conversation that we've had. We started off talking about grief and endings and reluctance to embrace those, but having listened to what you have just shared and how you share that, and also reading some of your work, it really is an invitation to surrender to not only the grief and the endings, but the hope and the beauty, and, as you say, some of the magic that comes with it as well. Because inherent in the suffering and in the grief is love, and I think there was something you wrote too, that love is grief and grief is love. And so, thank you for providing such a compelling invitation to do that. I've got one more question for you, but before I do, I'd like to share for people who may not be familiar with your work, um, just something that you posted a little while back. This is from January. This is one of your posts on Instagram, um, and there's the tiles, which are a bit of a summary of the post, but your caption always really sort of is something that is a real sort of deeper dive into the content. There's just two paragraphs from this particular post. The title is "This is the moment you've got. How will you use it?" I'd much rather you read this out, but got a far better storytelling voice than I do. But there's two paragraphs at the end. I just think I'd read this, and I think it's a nice way for us to wrap this conversation up. And I really feel like it encapsulates you too. So I'm curious as to see how this resonates when you hear it back. This is the last two paragraphs, so we're missing a little bit of context at the start, but I think you'll get the point. This is what you write. At the end, I'd like to pack my bags and set them in front of the door, waiting for whoever has come to take me to the next adventure. I'd like to imagine I'm being taken to a surprise party where those I love are waiting for me, arms that I've missed and eyes that have watched me from afar, who remember me as I was and always will be, in love and kindness. At the end of it all, I don't want to be filled with regrets or the fear of what might have been lost. I want to cross the threshold boldly and with the same uproarious joy I entered with. I want to be able to say I held nothing back. I wandered through every alleyway and went through each wide open door. I spent and was spent. I'm used up. There is nothing left for me here. I lived.
Yeah. I remember writing those words. It's interesting. I had the opportunity last year to spend a month in Crete, and it was real interesting because it was a gift. A patron invited me to their palatial estate, and board room was taken care of. I didn't have any expenses covered, and really just had my every need met. I went, and I thought I was going to go and be profoundly creative. Um, what I realized very quickly is that creativity requires, for me at least, the crunch of it all, the grit and struggle of life, those wide open spaces. Uh, they tended to dissipate my motivation, and so very quickly I settled into something I don't think I had given myself permission to do since I was a kid, which is just fritter. I mean, honestly, I luxuriated. I delighted. I would start my mornings with a decadent cappuccino, and like a hobbit, I would go to first and second and third breakfasts, and I'd switch over to Americanos by by lunchtime, and Negronis by midday. And I mean, it was a really decadent affair. Get to the end of the month, sitting on the beach, suddenly overwhelmed with shame, sadness, regret about time lost. Suddenly find myself negotiating. Give it back. Give me one more day. Give me that moment. Did I really do what I came to do? Did I really see what I needed to see? Did I really, or did I just talk about it? Was it all for show? Did I fill it out? Did I accomplish the purpose? And then suddenly it really hit me that I didn't want to end life that way. I don't want to end life negotiating with the ending. I don't want to end life wondering, regretting. And so, when my father passed this last month, I think I was so struck with the apparent reality of the labor of each last undertaking, the laboriousness by which he communicated. And he lost his voice at the end. He was a profound communicator, but he couldn't say anything. And I watched frustration take over. And then it was as though he found a way. He had started to beat out Morse code on his fingertip. Started to keep time to the music on his toes. He would nod gently. Every breath counted in the end. Who he turned his head to mattered. Who got his smile, the last smile, mattered. I think that we live under the illusion of impermanence, and it gives us a kind of that kind of decadence where we spend it as though it wasn't ending, but it is ending. And I don't want to end things with the regret of wondering, have I made the most of it? Yeah. And so really that what you read was a reflection of those two experiences, the one of this wonderful time there in Crete, and then the other watching my father pass, and really knowing, as you said, at the end of it all, I don't want to be filled with regrets or the fear of what might have been lost. And so I think that is really my commitment to life.
I feel like this entire conversation has been a response to this last question I have, which is related to the title of this podcast. It's inspired by a song called Satisfied Mind, the lyrics to a song called A Satisfied Mind, covered by a lot of people, Johnny Cash famously, and Jeff Buckley. But there's a couple of lines in the song that that really relates to so much of what you write about. It says, "When my life has ended and my time has run out, my friends and my loved ones, I'll leave, there's no doubt. There's one thing for certain, when it comes my time, I'll leave this old world, the satisfied mind."
Mm.
And so
Wow.
I feel like, as I said, so much of what we've been talking about is a response to this last question, but I'd love to learn about what a satisfied mind means for you.
Yeah. Well, I think it is really the culmination of all of these things that we've been talking about. For one thing, I think we practice satisfaction. Satisfaction is not a goal. Satisfaction is the way I step. It's the way I breathe. It's the way I reach. It's the way I speak. I think that sometimes we train ourselves to be very goal oriented, God. And when I do this, then I will be satisfied. And I got to be honest, that formula just never seems to work for anybody I know. Satisfaction isn't the outcome. Satisfaction is it's the how along the way. I think for me, satisfaction comes as the result and as the reality that this is not a practice life. This is the real thing. Friedrich Nietzsche was not just the name of my cat, but also the name of of one of my favorite philosophers. He had this kind of obsession, which he didn't really publicly write about too much. We find it in snippets. It's called the eternal recurrence. He was fascinated by this concept that is called eternal recurrence, or this idea that is life actually on a repetitive loop. You might think of an example of reincarnation as this, but it's actually even more interesting than that. And here's the kind of little game that one can play with one's mind. Imagine that each moment of our life is on a loop, not just from an event standpoint, like the same things happen to us, but the exact same way we approach it. Everything that we do and think and say, every state we are in, every emotion, everything will repeat endlessly for infinite number of times. How then shall you live? If you knew that this next moment doesn't just matter, but that the way you live this next moment would repeat infinitely, eternally, how would that change how you lived? Well, so let's just say a bad thing happens to you. Something really bad happens. Well, that bad thing is going to repeat infinitely. That's pretty shitty. But a lot of us take that bad thing that happens to us, and then we whine about it for the next decade. And we blame it, and we get stuck there. Well, guess what? That next decade is going to repeat infinitely also. So my reaction to that thing now is on infinite loop. What if I didn't have to have that reaction? What if I could choose a different reaction? What if my reaction to that bad thing could actually be the next infinite moment that takes me to another experience that I would want to infinitely repeat? That is how I live my life. I want the next moment, whatever the next moment is, to be lived well. How I react, how I engage, how I think, how I talk, what I do, ultimately who I am in this world. If it's on infinite loop, I want to make sure it's one I can live with.
Well, it feels for me like this conversation is this is a moment I'd be happy to have on Infinite Loop as an experience. It's an absolute pleasure and joy to share conversation with you and to hear you speak of life in all of its shimmery, shiny, shame-filled, guilt-ridden, hopeful, joyful, glorious, gracious, briefness, and all of it in between. The way in which you write about and talk about and 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 share the human experience is an absolute pleasure to witness and to be in conversation with. So I'd like to say thank you, and I appreciate you and your work. I know that there are a number of ways in which you enable people to work with you. The Rope is a men's group that I've had the pleasure to be a part of recently. I know you work individually with people and you work with couples as well. I understand you have a wisdom camp as well, which is another group. So this podcast will be released really soon. We're talking the end of February for those of you who are listening. How can people work with you? How can people learn more about what you do and how you do it?
Some cool opportunities coming up. Men, there will be a spring 2023 version of what Michael passed through called The Rope, which is a phenomenal experience. I think it's a transformative tool to help you consider the life that you are living, how you wish to live it. And I don't think I want to say much more than that, because really half the fun of The Rope is the mystery, what you're getting yourself into. But it is a very transformative tool I've experienced with hundreds of men across the years. And so there's one coming up in the spring of 2023. You can certainly go to my Instagram and register for that wait list. Also, my partner Christy and I will be working with couples. We're doing a beautiful group called Indulgence. We led this group last year, an online mastermind for couples who are looking to fireproof their relationship and build a relationship that counts. We're really excited about that. We love that. We learned a lot of lessons the first time around and can't wait to continue teaching those things. And such an exciting time to take on with couples who are doing the work of relating. And then finally, I do work with a very small number of women and men doing mentorship, which is just a beautiful time, which transformation is happening. It seems like transformation happens through the exchange of two souls entering the room as equals together. It's a really beautiful time that I treasure and have gotten to do with hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. So if that's something that people are interested in, I definitely encourage them to look into that too. I tend to only enroll at certain times throughout the year. So if you see me opening my rosters, definitely jump in on that one.
Yeah, from having spent 6 weeks working with you deeply over a couple of hours at least for each session. Can't recommend your work highly enough for anybody who resonates with what it is that you've heard today. Please go and check that out. All the details, of course, will be in the show notes. Rainier, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen, to share, and to be witness to your wisdom and your heart and your mind and some of these really profound stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.